Live from SABC studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg, welcome to this week's first edition of The Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo, and on the show this evening,
President Ramaphosa has ordered the withdrawal process of the Presidential Minute on the Executive Members Guide, commonly known as the Ministerial Handbook for 2022.
The gravy train gets derailed thanks to a public outcry. But will President Cyril Ramaphosa's promised review of that ministerial handbook give South Africans what they are hoping for? That's what we're going to examine in a moment.
There are several sticking points that have delayed that process, primarily between government and business.
Months after the deadline for a social compact between the government, business, labor and civil society lapses, the presidency reveals for the very first time that business is the stumbling block. We speak to business organizations. And while the nation is debating whether or not ministers deserve to get those generous specs, a report reveals how more and more rural households sleep hungry. We're going to look at that report. All of that coming up in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which starts right now. President Cyril Ramaphosa has withdrawn the latest changes he signed off on with regards to the Ministerial Handbook pending a review. The decision comes in the wake of a public outcry at amendments which effectively ensured that ministers and deputy ministers do not pay for water and electricity for their households. The decision was announced by presidential spokesperson Vincent Magwenya during a briefing this afternoon.
President Ramaphosa has ordered the withdrawal process of the Presidential Minute on the Executive Members Guide, commonly known as the Ministerial Handbook for 2022. The withdrawal will give effect to the 2019 version of the Executive Guide pending a review. President Ramaphosa acknowledges and appreciates the public sentiments on the matter. However, the impression created that the amendments were conducted in secrecy and to avoid public scrutiny is false.
Vincent Magwenya, the presidential spokesperson, telling the media this afternoon how it all happened. One of the questions, of course, was, did the president not anticipate the public outcry when he signed off on these new proposals?
We are at a stage where the president has listened. The president appreciates the public outcry in the context of the sort of economic, social pressures that a lot of South Africans are facing. The president is heartened with the fact that we have an active citizenry that on an ongoing basis participates in our democratic processes and sometimes vehemently so disagrees with decisions of government. And I think we can take heart to the fact that the president has ordered the withdrawal of this notice that gave effect to the guide pending a review, simply because he is attuned to the challenges that South Africans are faced with on a daily basis. I suppose with hindsight, we can say the intention behind the amendment was not a nefarious one. The intention was to try and find some form of balance between what ministers could afford to pay versus some of the costs that they have. Pretty much all of them have their own private residences, and by virtue of being ministers, they then inherit 2 official residences. So now you have a scenario where you have a cost for 3 homes. Be that as it may, we can no longer further debate that outcry and the merits of that outcry, except to say, let's accept what the public has given us as a message, and let's conduct a necessary review that will ensure that the next version of the guide is aligned to not only public's expectations, but to the realities that many South Africans face.
Vincent Magwenya, presidential spokesperson, speaking at that briefing this afternoon. And joining me now to weigh in on some of the attendant issues, I do have leadership expert Sandile Swana. I also have Dr. Levi Ndo, who is a political scholar and analyst. Good evening to both of you, gentlemen, and thank you very much for your time. What was interesting for me was how the presidential spokesperson kept going back, to justifying or reminding us of why, the situation is as it is. In other words, all these pecs that South Africans have been saying are very, very generous indeed, actually have to be, or are the way they are. And perhaps for a bit of context, because it is not just about the story of the water and electricity that these ministers and deputy ministers are not going to pay for, while the rest of us pay for them. But there's these other pecs, which are add-ons, which I think contributed significantly to how South Africans were viewing this whole thing. I'm hoping we're going to bring up, some of these. Ministers live in, rent-free, government houses in Pretoria and in Cape Town. They get allowances for ministerial vehicles that have now been raised from about 700,000 to about 800,000 at both places or cities. They're provided with VIP drivers and protectors. They are provided with 88 flights per year. And now the department, which is public works in this instance, is responsible for the costs of water and electricity. And there's a host of others that have actually been added on, which provide for messengers, more domestic workers, more drivers, in addition to what had been there already and which many people thought was generous indeed. Let me start with you, Mr. Swana. Just your thoughts, just from what we know, from what we're told today, on the back, of course, of that history and context or background that we saw in that little graphic that we put up. Just your thoughts.
Thank you so much. Very quickly, let us start off by understanding that the historical context that you have provided is not enough, because by 2012 we're in exactly the same situation. I was watching an interview by was it Timboli and Somadoda Fikeni on the back of this ministerial handbook, having been promised by the Zuma regime and Collins Chabane that it would have been reviewed by 2010, before the 2010 World Cup, because of similar expenditures. And Lindiwe Mazimbu of the DA actually launched a big campaign at the time on the back of the Nkandla gate. Nkandla was supposed to be 100,000 according to the ministerial handbook, but it went to 250 million. So this handbook, this ministerial handbook, is a key. It's the largesse, the book, the key which is used to actually provide as many generous benefits by the president exclusively without the scrutiny of parliament. So this is the gravy train itself on the part of the president. And he now opens this in view of the 2024 ANC elections to strengthen his position in the ANC among the cabinet, which are almost exclusively ANC, apart from Patricia de Lille, if I remember correctly. So this is a disaster that has many, many years in the making.
That's a very important, a context. It's great to have, institutional memory when we talk about these things, because, as you say, I mean, this is not something that started yesterday, and I would even say add to that promises that were made by the president when he took over as president, that they're going to review the number of ministers and deputy ministers that we have, because that, contributes significantly to how the government is viewed, and needless to say, to the expenses that we as taxpayers have to incur. But we'll get into those issues in a moment. For you, Dr. Ndo?
Good evening, Vuyo. Good evening to my colleague Sanile and the viewers at home. We have got a situation where the Ministerial Handbook has to be reviewed on a regular basis. And one has to acknowledge and agree that, of course, on the basis of the positions that they occupy in society, there could be perks and benefits associated with the position. And what you observe on a regular basis is that you always get a situation where, instead of decreasing on the expenditure, it appears as if there is a program to always increase the expenditure of political office bearers. And what comes to mind each time you hear of a political office bearer is that these are people that are elected or who have actually volunteered to serve the people and not to serve themselves. And what I'm trying to say here is that ministers, by their own desire and by commitment to the nation, are people that are supposed to be selfless, and what they do will be to ensure that people have to come first. So when you have got a situation like this one, in times when the economy is not doing well, in times when there is a high number of unemployed people and the poverty rates are going high, you have a sense that it appears as if there has been an element of being insensitive on the part of those who are supposed to review issues like the Ministerial Handbooks. What one would have expected is that ministers themselves, in their own corners, would have, after seeing these amendments, would have said, President, I think this is enough. What we get appears to be enough. Maybe we can channel some of these resources in order for them to serve certain projects that can benefit the people on the ground. But equally, citizens agree that there are benefits or perks that should be assigned to these offices. But it should be done in a manner that these ministers are able to do their work, but it should not be seen as something that is done in an extravagant manner. Because if that appears to be the case, it sends a very, very wrong message to the public in general.
Well, take a listen, both of you, to how, when I ask some of the questions both of you are raising, just how he responded when we spoke here on the program last week. At a personal level, when you sit and with everything that you've since heard people saying over the past couple of days especially. Are you comfortable? Is your conscience clear? Do you not feel, given your background and everything you've done over the past 3 or so decades, that maybe this calls for a relook?
Well, every decision the states or government takes is a continuous subject of evaluation. So this one will not be an exclusion. But you are saying, in my personal capacity, let me tell you, as I talk to you now, in the house where I am in Cape Town, I pay rent monthly. In my house in Gauteng, that my private abode, I pay no less than 8 or 9 or 10,000 for services. I also just want to draw your attention. In the house where I am, the Khanendendal, all ministers who sit here do get load-shielded. If somebody doesn't believe, people must come and check that. So if we say it personally, as far as I'm concerned, because I'm not staying in this house for luxury, I work here 24 hours, and I'm only in this house purely for the purpose of serving government, using the infrastructure which is suited for that purpose. So as far as I'm concerned, I think it looks fair to me.
Minister in the presidency, the Mohanle Kungubele. And, you know, because what I was trying to do, with that question, as Dr. Ndo was saying, Mr. Swana, we're trying to shift it away from us being bookish about this thing. This is what there is. This is what was or has always been provided for. To saying, someone like Mohanle Kungubele, who has spent decades as a union leader, but as a civic leader as well, does it sit well with him when people are raising the most obvious questions? And that, of course, was their response. So I was trying to move away from someone that says, but, this has been in existence for decades. And this is where one was hoping for someone to then show leadership. And as Dr. Ndo was saying, when this landed in front of them, then these ministers would have said, oops, let's have a look at this thing again. And if their consciences were really still there, and if they were the unionists, the civic leaders who rose through the ranks, who know where we are coming from and where they are taking us, something like this would have jumped at them and said, look, something is just not right, especially right now, with everything confronting this nation.
Yes, it is quite interesting, actually, that in 2012, what was said is that during these economic tough times in 2012, the ministers should not be really getting bigger cuts. For instance, a person would say, you get 70% of your salary to buy a car. So your car must be valued at 70%. That's the maximum it can be, which means your car can actually be 30% of the 2 million. It can even be 20% of the 2 million. Now, but every other leader, minister, wants to push the envelope to the 70% that is maximum, which means that what you might call avarice, the greed to maximize what is there, even if it's not necessary to do so. Secondly, the issue that was raised even back then, what do other comparable progressive countries that are led by left-wing parties, what do those leaders actually do? For instance, leaders in India and elsewhere, what do they do? And you find that actually they are not doing this. They are not driving the types of cars that are being driven by these people. Some of them drive locally made cars. There's an insistence that the car must be locally made, etc., 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 etc. But at the end of the day, from a leadership point of view, what you do physically must manifest what you truly believe and where you are taking the people. So if you have a message, as the present leadership has, of austerity, They say everybody must embark on austerity. Yet they are enlarging their belts. They say everybody must tighten the belt. Yet they are actually taking their belts, making them 4 notches larger so that their bigger stomachs can fit inside those larger belts. And that is not exemplary leadership. And we are not saying people should not be fairly compensated. A school teacher should be fairly compensated. A medical doctor should be fairly compensated. But the spirit of greed, uncontrolled avarice, is exactly what is causing this controversy. And the DA is seeing exactly what they saw between 2010 and 2012, and when they were fighting with Zuma, and they want to use this now in the 2024 election in the same way that they used it in Zuma. And Cyril should see this bullet coming.
Well, of course, I mean, a question was asked. In fact, Vincent Magwenya was asked about whether this was, as the DA claims, in response to their call saying they are also going to involve the public protector and so on. Take a listen to what how Vincent Magwenya answered that particular question.
The president did not change his mind because the DA screamed at him from the rooftops. The president listened to the sentiments of ordinary members of the public, and the president accepted that with hindsight, a review is necessary to the Ministerial Handbook. As for the political point scoring, opposition parties are opposition parties, they'll do what they do. The public should just, as I said, take comfort that they have a government that listens. I think we should all take comfort that we still live in a very robust constitutional democracy where citizens are active and citizens are vocal about issues they feel strongly about, and more importantly, that they get a response from their government rather than being ignored. For me, those are the key takeouts. We'll let the opposition do what it needs to do. And from an executive point of view and the president's perspective, he will lead the process that needs to run its course now with that review. And hopefully that process can be expedited as soon as possible.
We should take comfort, Dr. Ndou, the fact that we have a listening government and a very vibrant civil society, should we?
Of course, I think even now that we to go back and relook at this matter, it's also a clear indication that on the part of the civil society in South Africa, that voice is always being heard. But what would always be my concern is that when each time when there is supposed to be an amendment on the code, it is always about more and more expenditure and not any other form of deductions. You need to have a very strong personnel surrounding the minister so that he or she is able to perform the responsibilities given to him by the state and ensure that everything else is done in a much proper way. But equally, you need the leadership of the state that is able to say, we have got many, many challenges that are facing us, and we don't have to be seen as people that want to occupy these positions for the purposes of enjoyment and enriching ourselves only. They should lead by example. Where there is no necessity for certain benefits to be directed towards their direction, they should not even have to look at what is not available and want to attract more and more benefits. We want to see leaders who should take pride in changing people's lives, not their lives having changed. Because the purpose of a leader is to be selfless and focus on the people that have put them in those positions. And unfortunately, this does not appear to be the case with our South African leaders. Hence, we have this kind of outcry. But now that they've listened maybe each time these amendments are supposed to be made, there is going to be a sense that knock into their system, that we've got a public out there that is constantly watching us, that is actually going to raise their voices and very high, so that we don't do what is not appropriate.
Mr. Swana, Dr. Ndo talks about the qualities, but also what should drive our leaders. And I want us to end it on a point that I think shouldn't be overemphasized, which Mr. Magwenya himself, the presidential spokesperson, also spoke about, and that is the role of civil society when wrongs are committed and when they don't like things, to be vocal. It actually reminds me of a, this TikTok thing is there's a what appears to be a father-son conversation about electricity, where the son says to the father, but we haven't seen you as parents doing anything, otherwise we shouldn't be, or we wouldn't be where we are right now. But the point I'm making as a final point is that the role of civil society when things like this happen cannot be overemphasized. And this particular episode has actually shown that there are, in fact, gains to be made when we are vigilant and vocal about these things.
Civil society should be vigilant, but not forgetful. This issue, had we stuck with it from 2010 and raised it on a continuing basis, by now, the whole code would have changed. There would be a presidential oversight committee. There is no oversight, but by around 2010, 2012, it was demanded. So we need, all I can say is that we need to be robust. We need to be not forgetful. We must trace a matter and speed it up until it is concluded. This Leon Schrober says that he has discovered and uncovered. But these things that he has discovered and uncovered on the part of the DA relative to the Ministerial Handbook are exactly the same things that Lindiwe Mazibuko was busy with. And Leon Schrober is presenting them as if they are new. Valvi has seen the corruption over many years and is still speaking about it. But you speak for 5 minutes, you rest for 3 years, speak for 5 minutes. That is not how we're going to win this battle.
Let me thank both of you for coming through today, Mr. Swana, and of course, Dr. Thank you very much, for coming on the program. But on to another matter now, still related to that briefing by the president. It's been 8 months since President Ramaphosa announced a social compact between the government, business, labor, and civil society. Government now says, well, from what the presidential spokesperson told us, the stumbling block to the finalization of this compact has been business. Take a listen to what Vincent Magwenya had to say.
There are several sticking points that have delayed that process, primarily between government and business. To a large extent, even though it's a process that involves other stakeholders. I don't think it's fair or accurate to say the cause of the strike at Transnet is due to the absence of the social compact. As you will know, South Africa will regularly have these cycles of labor action. And those labor disputes are well within their rights in terms of the legal and constitutional framework. So I won't attribute the strike to the absence of the social compact. More broadly, there is an understanding and commonality amongst all social partners with respect to what needs to be done to achieve the objectives of the country's economic reconstruction and recovery plan. There are minor differences in terms of specifics, but there isn't a crisis or there isn't a huge gap with respect to what do we all need to do to accelerate the country's economic growth.
Well, joining us now is the CEO of the Black Business Council, and that's Mr. Hanki Matabane. Mr. Matabane, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. As far as you know, is business to blame for the fact that 8 months on and about 3 months, if I'm not mistaken, after the expiry of that deadline the president himself imposed, we still don't have this much talked about social compact?
Good evening, Buyo, and good evening to the viewers. And thank you very much once more for having us here. I think maybe let me give you the context. So we had a meeting with the president, being business with the president before the SONA. And then in that meeting, we agreed that we'll have continuous bilaterals with the president and his cabinet, and we agreed that we'll have what is called 4 aside from each, so that we can prepare for a full session, and that session was supposed to last at least a full day, where we'll unpack all the issues that are contained in the a recovery plan. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately that did not happen. And the next time we had was the president announcing at the SONA the 100 days, and then I think that's where this challenges that the first
problem started.
Yes, because the agreement was not necessarily to go and have meetings with all the social partners at the same time, because business, as the president did announce at the SONA, is the one that is likely to create jobs and reduce unemployment. The government needs to make sure that the environment is very conducive for that. And I think that's where probably maybe business then started feeling that we may or may not be taken serious. The things that we're proposing are not necessarily implemented, and then also I think business also sort of feels that we don't need to do a lot of talk, because there've been a lot of other commitments that were made that needs to be implemented. We just need to see them implemented. For example, from our side, we spoke about the various things. For example, to say government is not a good payer of small business, for example. Mm. And we ask questions. We even asked the president, but president, we know we're in a democracy, but why can't you just tell all your ministers to pay small businesses in 30 days, but also pay them the money that has been due for the past years, and then demand a report every month from those relevant ministers, and that does not necessarily need a compact. It just needs action. There are various other issues, for example, of dealing with what you call the public procurement bill. It doesn't necessarily need a compact. It needs implementation to say, President, you always say 40% of government spending will be set aside for women. And it's a good intention, but where is the legislation to implement that? And again, that does not necessarily need a compact. It just needs action to say, we were busy with the public procurement bill. Let's make sure that that section is included in the bill, so that when it becomes an act, no one is going to question it. When the state procurement for the entire state, national, provincial, local, state-owned enterprises, is set aside for women. And then we can set aside some for Black people, and set aside some for people living with disabilities and youth. Because those, for us, we think will invigorate the economy. If you pay small businesses everything that you owe, because some of them they even have to close shops because they are not paid. That will bring a lot of economic activity in the economy. If you set aside the procurement for women, that will ensure that women play a meaningful role in the economy rather than being spectators, and in particular black women.
In fact,
those are just two examples that I wanted to give, but they don't necessarily need a
social compact. In fact, I mean, I remember previously in other conversations I've had with other business leaders like Kaskuvadis, Bonang Mohales, and so on the program, the exact same things were raised. First, how this thing was announced or introduced, for which, as one of them said, then the person who made those pronouncements or went public and actually gave those deadlines to then account for how they got there and for what has not been done. And secondly, which gets to the issues, the second point you're raising, which is what you are asking government to deliver on the promises that it has made, on commitments that it has actually made, which, as you say, don't really need a compact. In fact, it's what would then lead or speed things up. And there was another, I don't know if it's an issue that I think Business Unity South Africa also raised, saying also part of the advantage of the bilaterals is that you are going to have time to iron out a number of issues before you get to or you meet with the other social partners, so that you speed things up, number one. But secondly, you also avoid situations where people may grandstand in front of others, because between the two of you, the understanding was that the government was also going to do the same with civil society and labor if need be. In other words, these bilaterals were not exclusively for business, but when you meet at NEDLAC, all of you, it was in the hope that many issues would have been dealt with, so that you have fewer issues and less time to deal with those issues when you eventually meet as the four partners. Am I correct in that?
You are absolutely correct, because when you have two people in a room, it's different from when you then add two other people who are coming from different angles. For example, when we have labor in the room, labor will say business must not retrench. And when we look at the issues of retrenchment, it's very difficult to put that in a social compact, because it's an economic issue per business. Remember, business is different from labor, where you have a COSA 2 that almost dictates to the other members. But in business, if you are business A, your costs are more than your revenue. You've got no any other choice. Either you close the business, or you have to retrench people. But those things you can negotiate them in a bilateral. That does not necessarily include labor. Hence, we were saying, let's deal with the bilateral issues. By the time we go to a structure like NEDLAC, where everyone is there, we'll have had a very, very, very few things to address. For example, there's an issue again of localization. We've been saying, if you want to create jobs in South Africa, we need to make sure that we localize. And that needs, again, doesn't need the social compact, just needs decisions. To say, let's look at what we are buying from other countries that we can do here. Either we can manufacture here, or we can assemble here, or we can produce them here. And that can be done. We don't necessarily need a compact that then also takes 2 years to agree. By the time you come back, you can't do anything. And we've missed an opportunity during COVID, where we could have manufactured a lot of other consumables that we're using here. like now, the issue that we raised is that South Africa is the biggest consumers of ARV medication. Why are we not producing it here, the ARV medication here, so that we can create jobs here in South Africa, because we need jobs here. And then we're sitting on a time bomb where basically we've got the highest unemployment in the world. So when we've got the highest unemployment in the world, you need to look at what can reduce unemployment. Localization will do, but supporting small business, because remember, the government is got what is called the National Development Plan, which is the NDP 2030, and there are things that needs to be done in that plan. And for example,
in fact, that takes us nicely to the where I wanted us to end this conversation, because we're talking about a social compact, not for the sake of a social compact. It is because everyone seems to agree that we do need a social compact, with or without some of the things you're saying, for example, are not things we need to get to a social compact. But we need one, because it takes us to a point where each of the social partners says, this is what we're putting on the table, but also this is what we're prepared to forgo for the sake of addressing, our economy challenges. Our economy is in the doldrums. We have record high unemployment levels. We cannot continue like this. So it wasn't, a social compact for the sake of a social compact. But two quick ones to you, Mr. Matawana. One, are you hopeful that we'll get there? We'll get to the social compact. Hopefully sooner rather than later. And then in its absence, do the social partners see a way out of the terrible economic situation we are in and the record high unemployment levels?
Yes, I'm confident that we will get there. But again, our view is that it will only happen and happen quicker if we go back to bilaterals. And then have bilateral discussions with business ourselves, and then we have government can have it with the labor and have it with the other social partners, because that will speed up the process. Remember, now we're sitting in October, and the announcement was made in February. We were basically 3 months or so before the next zone, and as you know, in business, business works on key performance areas and key performance indicators. So the expectation will be that the president will announce how far did the social compact work. Not only that it was concluded, how far it went in addressing our high unemployment rate. And I'm afraid it doesn't look like there might be much to report. So if we go to the bilaterals this October, I'm sure middle of November we may be done with the contentious issues, and then we can then look at the what we call the low-hanging fruits that can be implemented between now and the next SONA, so that when the president makes an announcement in the SONA, there will be progress made, progress today to say, we've done this, we've done this, we've done this. Otherwise, it may be difficult to announce much. But I'm very confident that South Africa, we've achieved much through negotiations, but it shouldn't be protracted negotiations that are negotiations for the sake of negotiations. There must be action and implementation. And then the issues that I've raised, for example, they can be implemented between now and December. We don't necessarily need to wait for the next SONA.
Mr. Matawana, let me thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
CEO of the Black Business Council, on the back, of course, of the assertion by the presidency that the reason we still don't have a social compact 8 months after this was announced and 3 months after the expiry of that deadline that the president imposed was largely because business has some issues which have not been resolved up until now. Mr. Matabane basically saying that simply isn't the case. Well, we'll see what happens beyond this point. Well, while the nation is debating whether or not we have a social compact or why we don't have it, whether or not ministers deserve to get those generous specs, a report has revealed how more and more rural households sleep hungry. That's what we're getting into in a moment. Don't go away. As the global community, we're commemorating and celebrating World Food Day and the International Day of Rural Women over the weekend. South Africa's Rural Women's Assembly today reports that there is very little to celebrate as countless of people in the region continue to starve and large numbers of children go to bed without food. This is especially true for women-headed households. Essentially, most rural women say they are poorer. Mercia Andrews, the regional convener, joins us to highlight some of the demands rural women have had to flag over the past couple of days. Mercia, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. You know, earlier as we were debating whether or not, our ministers should, or deserve to not pay for electricity and water, how many cars they should get, how many messengers, how many drivers, how many domestics, and so on. Here, I mean, this report paints a disturbing picture of what is happening in our rural communities, especially.
Yes, thank you, firstly, Vuyo, for inviting us. It's really the conversation this week in the media about payments for services and so on. I think it's important that these things are in the public domain. And this is also why I'm very pleased that you invited the Rural Women's Assembly to come and speak on your platform this evening. The issue for us of food is very much linked to the question of land and the way in which land reform, if I'm specifically going to focus on South Africa tonight, even though the Rural Women's Assembly is based across the region. The issues there are similarities, but there are also many differences. And South Africa in that way is an outlier in that many rural women don't have access to land, because land is a means by which women can create for themselves food security, can create livelihoods and so on. And our argument is that to a large extent in South Africa, the land reform program that promised 30% of land, arable land, to rural people, to poor people, as ways of redress for the unfinished business of apartheid. This hasn't happened. Land reform, the amount of land that's been transferred to poor people in this country is minimal. At best, if it wasn't for restitution, land redistribution would be less than 8% and so on. And we can talk about that. So that, I think, is one issue that we're flagging, that land reform has literally grounded to a halt. It's become the step how shall I put it? It's the program
Child of
within
the,
government that receives the least amount of resources, despite its political significance. In fact, commercial agriculture, government supports commercial agriculture much more, holds it in place, sees it as critical, as opposed to seeing the significance of land reform for ordinary people, particularly for rural women. So this is quite a critical issue.
And that's why you're saying, I mean, in part, in what you send out today, that you now want to promote the rights to say no, insist on exercising women's rights to an alternative development path. Instead of placing our survival and sovereignty in the exploitative hands of agro-industries and mega-seed companies, you promote alternatives. What are those alternatives?
Well, we promote a number of alternatives. One of it is if you take the Western Cape, we see hectares and hectares and hectares of vineyards. But you don't see people growing food so that people can survive. So we are promoting a different model of agriculture. We're saying we're promoting smallholder agriculture where food is before profits. We say land must be redivided so that people don't have 2,000 hectares. One person doesn't own 20 farms, but that many people have access to land where they can grow food, but also grow food in an alternative way, in a sustainable way that is cognizant of the environment, that is agroecological, that is that people can afford. They don't have to buy expensive fertilizer, expensive pesticides, and buy seeds from multinational companies. But to promote traditional ways in which people have always planted food, and also to begin to go back to traditional kinds of food that people have had in the past, so that
but of course we also know but we also know, I mean, that a lot of the land is in the hands of people who are either hogging it because they hope to make more money, or who are farming it because they make a lot of money out of it, and no one wants to give to those who don't have. And as the debates have been going on over the years here in our country, there simply isn't a great deal of willingness on the part of our government to actually address this situation. They continue to pander to the interests of big business in the main.
So you're absolutely correct, and you are echoing our view. We are saying there is a lack of political will. Even recently, there was a very big debate the government unlocked about expropriation of land. Where did it go? Nowhere. Even though the present constitution allows for expropriation, it just went nowhere. We debated, people were led down the garden path, and then it went nowhere. So our view is that very little has changed. Landholding patterns remain exactly, more or less, 70% of arable land remains in the hands of white commercial agriculture. I want to be very frank about this. And in the former homelands, there is overcrowding, the land has been overused, there isn't infrastructure. So all of these things mitigate against poor people actually becoming their agriculture, creating enough of a livelihood. We need much more support. We need much more investment. We need to begin to think of smallholder agriculture as a livelihood strategy, as a way in which people can fend for themselves, a way in which we can rebuild a rural economy. There is no vision for a rural economy in this country either.
Mr. Andrews, let's leave it there for this evening. Let me thank you very much for your time. This is from the Rural Women's Assembly, a disturbing report from their conversations this particular during this past weekend, that many rural folk continue to go to sleep without food on your table. We have run out of time. I was hoping that we would read some of your tweets. Many of you are really unhappy and supporting the review of that ministerial handbook, and of course pointing to the obvious things that are wrong with what was accepted, and which of course President Cyril Ramaphosa's office said today was going to be reviewed. And that's our show for tonight, but do join us again tomorrow evening, 8 o'clock sharp. Have a good night.